Well, how far should police be able to reach to catch terrorists? It's the crux of a court case here. In fact, the Ontario Court of Appeal has now ordered Vice to hand over its notes with a Canadian who's believed to have joined the ranks of ISIS somewhere in the Middle East.
Come to me, I will come to you. Attack me, I will attack you. If you attack one of us, we will attack one of you.
This is Canadian Farah Sherdon, somewhere in the Mideast, being interviewed by Vice about his allegiance to ISIS.
We are going for you, Barack Obama.
He's wanted on terror-related charges and has become the de facto linchpin in a debate in this country that pits freedom of the press against the powers of police. Vice has, for a second time, been ordered to hand over to the RCMP all notes, screenshots of conversations and texts with Sherdon.
What this case was about was essentially a fishing expedition on the part of the RCMP to try and establish a precedent to make sure that any time that they want to access confidential information that journalists have, they'll be able to do so.
Media outlets argued that they should not be used as an investigative arm of the law and that forcing a reporter to hand over notes would prevent other sources from coming forward.
If a source thinks that journalists will just hand over their material, their correspondence with the government, and the government can force them to do that, they simply won't talk to journalists.
But in tossing out the appeal, the judge says Sherdon was not a confidential source and in fact was anxious to broadcast his views to the world. When people hear about a reporter holding on to information about a terrorist, they say, give it to the cops if it can help get this guy behind bars.
They do. So let's just step back from the highly contentious issue of terrorism and say, what if it happens somewhere else? What if it happens at a public institution like a university? What if it happens within the federal government? What if it happens within a private corporation? We want to be able to protect people who provide information to journalists. And journalists aren't there to be agents of the police. We're not just a cool little investigative technique that law enforcement has. We're supposed to be an independent monitor. And that independence goes out the window once the police say at any point, oh, you should just hand that over now.
Whatever regime attacks us, we will attack them.
The judge has ruled that the chat messages between Sherdon and the Vice reporter amounted to a confession and could provide reliable evidence to support charges against the suspected ISIS terrorist if and when he's captured. Vice has said all relevant information about Farah Sherdon has already been published, and the Canadian Journalist for Free Expression does not buy the argument that police need a reporter's notes and screen grabs for evidence.
The charges have already been laid against this suspected ISIS fighter, and it's an enormously high bar of evidence in order to lay terrorism charges. So the government must have already had an enormous amount of information already. This is why we are really concerned about, this wasn't about gathering evidence, it was more about forcing a journalist to hand over the notes so that that kind of precedent might be set.
And Vice says it's not handing anything over to anyone. They're planning to appeal this to the Supreme Court of Canada.